put in any data from any profession, in any country, at any period, and the hitherto elusive answers to those perennial questions that I just asked, and more, will be revealed. Feminism should take that science seriously.
That's the video I had posted for our second half tonight.
When do you want the second exam? Just as a refresher.
I think it's next Friday, I think. Yeah, what's up, man? I'm listening to the doc again.
Next week, okay.
So, October 19th.
You want it that Sunday though, don't you? Or the 21st? Or is it due on the 19th?
It could be that weekend. There's no real hurry. I don't actually decrease a person's grade because it's a few days late or something, because then I would have to do math.
Right. Makes sense.
So this isn't a math class?
Depends on what you mean by math, of course. Because in a manner of speaking, everything is math. So, just like what we talked about, if a tree falls in the forest, there's no one there to make to hear it doesn't make a sound. We're being ambiguous on many accounts when we ask that kind of a question. Depending on the context where you're trying to answer, what do you mean by sound? Vibrations in the air. But it could also mean something different depending on the picture you have of the universe, how the universe works. So, David Hume might have said, what tree? What forest? Famously, Bishop Berkeley said, well, God is there, and so he hears the tree fall, regardless of whether or not we're there. Locke, on the other hand, and an American common sense point of view, which is, I think, pretty much Locke, would say, of course it makes a sound, the squirrels hear it, whatever, like.
Presuming there's squirrels in your forest.
Yeah. Well, I remember too, there's all kinds of things. I think I mentioned the advertisement when I was a kid, that the Sony huge tape recorder with the tree falling behind it. It says, what Sony hears is, And you could still argue over that, because strictly speaking, what you're hearing is a hissing on the tape or a crashing on the tape, not necessarily a tree. You're assuming that it recorded a tree falling, but what you're actually hearing when you play back the tape is the tape.
Right. The magnetic strip rubbing against the contact.
Exactly. So you can play with the meaning of all of these. Annoys the heck out of certain individuals, because there was a tradition. C.S. Lewis, by the way, represents this tradition, that what a teacher is doing is teaching his students, of course predominantly male students, because they didn't have very many female students back when that was still the point of view, that he was teaching the correct meanings, correct pronunciations, etc., of the words, and that's what an education was. Learning to speak and write correctly. And that's when you're assuming that it's wrong to think that there's alternative meanings to the words, depending on context. Because that wasn't part of the picture. that picture changed when Ludwig Wittgenstein began arguing for it. You might have heard other people arguing for it too. Clearly Hegel, in his own way, is talking about that as words evolve, context changes, and so on. So clearly for Hegel, you could say this is a glass and this is not a glass. And you have to expand on that and say, well, this is a glass. And sorry, I'm boring. That's the way philosophy class is. You always pick something nearby. And just go, this is a mug. You know how many times I've talked about the mug, or tables. We got tables. But in different contexts, it could certainly mean different things. And I talked about the particles are the real thing, as opposed to the table. That just seems weird. Why would you do that? Well, I guess there's a context. If you put it into a physics context, where they're talking about the way we perceive the variety of energy around us is based on our language giving us concepts that we use to visualize a limitation to those particles that creates us, in us an image of a table. That's actually remarkably similar, I think, in my understanding of how Plato was trying to talk about ideas. For him, the reason I see the table is because I have the idea of tableness. And that enables me then to perceive certain fluctuating objects in my changing environment as instantiations of that idea. That sounds an awful lot like what we're talking about with physics today. John?
I see those similar characteristics, like even if you change the perceptive tools they're using. For instance, ants communicate via pheromones, and moths and bats communicate in a different way, for instance. So they're using the mediums that are available to them based on their evolutionary arc.
Right.
But there's a huge amount.
And we're
of
coming to realize that when
Yeah.
we're talking about how we're seeing things through a human perspective, but bats might have a totally different perspective. No wonder I can't think the way a bat does. I don't know what it's like to be a bat. Well, the folks we're supposed to start with tonight are Thomas Hobbes and Karl Marx. That's kind of an odd juxtaposition, of course. Well, I did that deliberately. And that's because they, in a way, represent two opposite points of view. You could
Sorry.
in starting with Thomas Hobbes, though, I don't think we've not talked about Hobbes already, have we? In this class? I don't think so. Or have I?
Briefly, like just as a
Touched on once or twice, but no
Well, we can actually have handy dandy notes that don't match our the way we. Well, let's see, maybe 11. No, much earlier. Still earlier. Still earlier. Still early. Wow. That's pretty good. So when we talk about Hobbes, claimed he was born a twin of fear. That's kind of famous. But his mother gave birth to him 2 weeks early, or roughly 2 weeks early, I guess. And the reason he thinks she did that was because the Spanish Armada was coming, she was afraid of what that entailed. I don't know if you remember Queen Elizabeth riding on her white horse with her red hair along the beach, was going to single-handedly keep the Spanish. Meanwhile, of course, Sir Walter Raleigh was out there with a fire ship because the Spanish had tried to avoid damage from a storm, so they tied all the ships up in the Armada into one big mass, and Sir Walter Raleigh led 4 fire ships sailing right into the mass of ships, and they set them all on fire and wiped out the Armada. Pretty nasty trick.
Standard Navy practice of that, actually.
Really? I hadn't heard.
Yeah, no, the fire ship.
Until I saw the movie.
Fire ship techniques considered, they usually take a cheaper ship and just
So,
Going all the way back to Greek.
so fortunately, they didn't have the Spanish take over. Of course, the Elizabethan era was on its way when the empire becomes an empire. But he's also, along with Descartes, of the age when people were getting educations but not becoming priests or monks. So that's kind of interesting. And as a educated person, one of the things he also realized was that the nobles, who were the ones who were now they were always the rulers, but they would always listen to the priests as their guides, but now they were, I guess, becoming more independent, and so they needed to have a bit more of an education than they used to get, but they didn't have the time to learn Greek, and so the educated people that did speak Greek would translate it for them. And one of the political treatises that was pretty important was the history of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides, the main moral point being that thou shalt not beat thy neighbor to a pulp and expect no payback, basically. Because once they finally got beaten by Sparta afterwards, then they got pretty much the same kind of payback thanks to the way they treated Miletus, or the Milesians. One of his tutees was eventually King Charles II. So obviously the heir to the throne while he's teaching him was King Charles I as the king, who, by the way, of course, has his head chopped off courtesy of Oliver Cromwell. Yes? Civil War between the king and the parliaments. Oliver Cromwell then becomes Lord Protector. And eventually, of course, dies, and then when King Charles II is king, he has Oliver Cromwell's body dug up, his head chopped off, and put on a stake outside of London, the Gate of London. Paybacks.
So is that a message or a payback?
Yeah. Either way, I suppose. However, I don't think it hurt the corpse very much. Still, it's kind of interesting. Oliver Cromwell's secretary was John Milton, the poet. And there's tons of paperwork that Milton wrote as the secretary. He was like really the one-hand man running the ship of state. Hobbes was inspired by Galileo's concept of motion. He's in perhaps even in physical contact with Galileo person to person, although I doubt it. He was in Italy. Hobbes did go to Italy, took his tutee up the mountains, and as they were climbing, they found all these fossils, and they wondered, how the heck did these get washed up here? Because it was way up in the mountains in Italy. And he concluded that it must have happened during the flood. could have been Hurricane Michael, but sorry about that. Anybody have any relatives in that area? The whole towns are wiped out. That's really bad.
What I get a kick out of is these pictures of lots of flotsam and jetsam in the sea, and postulating that we have a bunch of garbage floating in the sea. And I think to myself, yep, hurricanes are pretty devastating, and they're going to rip apart anything. And of course it sticks out because it's different than seaweed or kelp or a piece of log or something. But it's still just man-made junk that got blown out to sea by a natural cause. It's not like we're dumping our trash in the
saw a
ocean.
picture of a big boat sitting in a person's house.
Yeah.
In one of Panama Beach or where.
I'm gonna go and just say gyres, something else, but you can imagine a 100-mile wide dump site in the ocean. It's kind of
Oh, that. Yeah.
There's a few of those.
So, Hobbes applies this Galilean insight to human psychology and concludes basically that we are machines. Remember, Descartes does the same thing, although Descartes has the concept of the soul or the mind as interrelated or dialectically interacting with the body through perhaps the pineal gland. So he's a dualist, a mind-body dualist. Hobbes is not. The body is the whole thing. That's all you got. And guess what? That makes it pretty clear that when you die, your soul is done. And so that's I think one of the things that really would have gotten him in trouble with the church. But of course, at the time in England, the church is in disarray. You've got the Civil War, which is essentially over religion. King Charles was Catholic, and King Charles II. That's ambiguous, but they were Protestant, but not Protestant following any particular religion from Europe. Instead, it was, of course, remember, the Church of England. But what does that mean? It was in disarray. It's not something that you could clearly get in trouble for. But I'm sure he was worried. And so if you read the Leviathan and you read the part where he describes the nature of religion, it's ambiguous. It might even be the case that he's an atheist, although it's not clear. And he doesn't want it to be clear, because he doesn't want to be burned at the stake, although probably they wouldn't do that, they'd just chop his head off. Saves on wood, I suppose. But that's, I'll just quick race through this, because I want to get to the politics part of it. But it being machines, what drives us is the basic happiness versus pain, right? You want pleasure and avoid pain. That's what the machine does. But the trouble, of course, then is how do we get a society? And Hobbes gives us a hypothesis. He imagines a state of nature. So it's a hypothetical state of nature. He has no real historical basis to figure out how life would be like before there were governments. But he hypothesizes it would be a state of war, of each against each. We'd all be just taking whatever we want. And it would be nasty, brutish, short. I mean, you could look at the famous quote. This is a really famous Hobbesian quote. And what's funny is it was never solitary for him because he was always living with other people. That's pretty clear. He didn't have a family himself, but he was always with relatively rich folks that would make sure he was being taken care of. So it wasn't necessarily poor either. It wasn't really nasty for him. In fact, I remember when King Charles II saw him later on, as he was riding down the street, he saw Hobbes standing there, and he famously says, "Hobbes, my old tutor, I owe you a pension." So he's retired in his 90s, playing tennis.
Trying to figure out which Mario Brothers game that was.
I don't know. I used to not be able to dance, by the way, and you might actually say that I still don't dance, depending on your point of view. But it was somewhere around 42 I suddenly realized the main reason I couldn't dance was because I was worried what people might think of me. And at 42 I realized I couldn't give a shit what people thought of me anymore. Suddenly liberated, you know.
I was just going to remark that this concept that he puts out seems very similar to the Hunger Games paradigm, where
Yeah.
they're put into this situation where it's a free-for-all, you know, and of course the heroine makes friends as allies, more or less, and even is congenial to those people that aren't as vicious as some of the other people,
Mm-hmm.
you know, personality-wise. In other words, and it shows you kind of
They become gangs.
right. They become gangs, right? And it's what is it based on? It's based on their collective protectionism, that they feel stronger with somebody else next to them, for instance. And I
Well,
don't know.
that's precisely what he thinks must have happened, perhaps.
Mhm.
And so what happens then is that they form a contract. So he calls this a social contract. Now, as far as I know, there might have been other use of that. In fact, I think there was one other author that might have influenced him by calling it a social contract at the time. In fact, we could also look at this as the result of kind of a Scottish point of view. In the book, if you're interested in books, How the Scots Invented the Modern World. But seriously, of course, it is a serious analysis of things. You could go back even further, of course. You know, there's a constant trail here, but the clear onset of this is Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation. The influence he has on John Calvin.
I was going to say the title here makes me think of I saw an episode of a sort of a quasi-comedy talk show thing called QI. It's basically about just random weirdness, but one of the questions at some point was something about name something invented in Scotland, and basically the host for the show, he then at some point rattles off all of these things that were invented in Scotland, and somewhere down the list was the U.S. Navy. So it's just like, oh yeah, right. It's like
There is a historian who argues that all the claims that the Scots have for inventing anything are false. Of course, he's a British, historian. But the way the basic plot goes is John Calvin, Martin Luther have an influence on John Knox, who's in Calvin's Switzerland in Geneva, and then he goes back home to Scotland and brings Calvinism to Scotland, and it becomes Presbyterianism. And the presbyters have the vote, and the presbyters are the ones that basically run the church, decide who the minister will be, roughly what the church focuses on, and the presbyters are essentially the wealthy white males that are members of the church. And that works well enough that it bleeds over into the politics of the communities, and so you end up with the white males that own the property, the leaders of the town, becoming the ones who now vote among themselves over who should rule, what the local rules, the laws should be, and that eventually affects Edinburgh, the University of Edinburgh, with this basis of good governance comes from a social contract among the individuals that are the leaders of the town. And that affects Hobbes, and so Hobbes then incorporates that into his, how do we get out of this state of nature, and that is, and by the way, I should add one other thing. In this state of nature, he hypothetically says everyone has all the rights to everything, so you have the right to the pizza, but if I kill you for it, that's perfectly fine, because I have the right to kill you if I like, so in other words, the rights are useless, because unless you're a big brute and you have power over the others, and you remember Conan the Barbarian, the musical, right? That basically becomes, the early ethical norm, the big brute, so the strongest, have the power, right? Then you end up with fighting, though, from one group to another. So you get the gangs fight, so you get multiple gangs. And so Hobbes basically argues that out of all of this, it becomes logically clear that the only safe, secure kind of government is an absolute monarch. You might think, whoa, how did you get to that, right? Because he's afraid of fighting. As long as there's a state of war, everyone's in danger. And as long as there's even two people involved in ruling and competing with one another, they're going to fight one another and use all their resources to do it. But if you get to the point where you now have one absolute monarch, that absolute monarch's interests are the exact same as the nation as a whole, and so that will be the end of warfare, says Hobbes.
That's what happened, isn't that Japan the same way with like the shogun? They had all these different, until
eventually they ended up with, and Hobbes wouldn't have known anything about that.
No, I just.
But yeah, it's kind of interesting that. Well, I mean, he was familiar with history, what history he had a sense of course. When we talk about Marx, we'll do the same thing. We'll say that Marx was basically trying to understand the nature of political history and how it evolved. Today, of course, we could look back at that and say that he really didn't understand nearly as much as we do today. In fact, I brought a contemporary to read a few pages this evening on that. Pretty interesting. And this just came out. It's still, I think, 20% off at Barnes & Noble's, if you feel like going. Find one. That was a blatant advertisement, wasn't it? Whatever. So I am addicted to books. I apologize. Other people have a life. I sit and read books and maybe listen to music while I'm doing it. That's pretty much mine. And pet my dog. And my dog does make me get up and take her out every once in a while. And this is a really rough week for us right now because she's in heat. We've never had that happen before. So we're beginning to rue the veterinarian's advice to wait until she was a year old before we had that done. Because we thought, oh, well, and she'll wait, right? She won't go into heat until after that. No, that
That's a bummer.
Already. And this is an over 100-pound dog that's bleeding all over the house. Sorry about that. It's not. My wife is very mad at me. She blames this whole dog business on me. Oh.
They have diapers for that.
I haven't gone out to research that yet, but I suspect that even everyone I've seen on the internet that says they've tried doing that, the St. Bernard's just not interested in being diapered.
At least it's not a cat. It's cats and heat.
Well, sorry, but so Hobbes comes up with this social contract, argues that we form a social contract, and in the contract we agree on the rights that we all have. And actually for Hobbes, we're going to give up those rights to the monarch. When we go to Locke, Locke is going to give us a different version of this. His hypothesis is that the state of nature is families, where everyone loves one another and takes care of one another, but they get too complex and complicated, and so we naturally start forming leadership groups and rules. And he's the one that offers the idea that there should be checks and balances, and that the king is basically there legitimately because the people want the king there, but that the king has to actually do what the king is supposed to do and not just do whatever the heck he feels like, right? And if he doesn't behave himself, we can decide to replace him. So the Locke's point of view is that you can revolt if you like. That's perfectly acceptable if the king deserves it. And keep in mind that Locke is accompanying William of Orange with the Glorious Revolution to throw James out. William is invited in by enough of the populace to get rid of James because they don't like James. So Locke is accompanying the new king who's they're revolting against the other king, and so obviously Locke's philosophy has to be that. He's basically explaining why that works that way. But Locke is the one that Jefferson admired the most, and Francis Bacon, John Locke, and Sir Isaac Newton are the three that Jefferson had pictures of in Monticello in his front room. If you ever get to visit, a great place to visit and see one of those ancient mansions, ancient by our standards, in the United States, right? Built on Italian models, thanks to Jefferson's opportunity to visit Europe as accompaniment to Ben Franklin as they were there as diplomats for the trade agreements from the beginning of the United States. So Marx is quite different. Marx now is a follower of Hegel, and so we're looking at quite a few years later. I've got a bunch of notes on Hobbes, but we could also go to Marx. Let's see.
Is it all on one page? Because you just Control F and search for the name.
Can I just search?
Yeah, Control F will bring up the search field, and then just put Marx in there, and it'll
Here we
find
go.
it.
So, if you're looking into Marx's friends, Ludwig Feuerbach would be one, Max Stirner's another, but Karl Marx. So, 1818, 1883. When we look at him, he's, as a philosopher, going to be primarily social science and economics, his influence. Although, of course, we certainly say that he's going to write the Communist Manifesto, which an edited version you just read, I suppose, By the way, what did you think of the bullet comments at the end? Were any of those worthy of being adopted, you think, by a decent society?
I have to double check them.
Remember the very last one? Bullet comments. And by the way, the very last line, I remember it being translated, of course, into Russian. You know, the trouble is, what? If I type it in Russian, will it work? I don't think so. What am I getting? Proletariat.
Oh, shoot. Proletariat's nothing but what does it roughly translate to as again?
Workers of the world unite. I could go like this.
My copy has working men of all countries unite, but yeah, that sounds.
Sounds all right.
In Russian, it was proletari, which is proletariat, Siech, which is all, Stran, which is the genitive case of strana, country. So, workers of all countries. Soyedinyayetis, which is like the United States is the Soyedinayeti, the Shtati. Gosh, how long ago has it been since I've been a Russian translator? 23 years. They just say Shah anymore, I guess. Stati American. Oh well, whatever. But so yeah, if you, I'll make that a quiz question actually. Which of those, if any, of the bullet comments that he thinks an established communism would be the kinds of things that a communist state would entail, right? You know what I mean?
What's the
You
question?
all have the text?
What about the bullet? What are you asking about? Which of the bullet points?
So, the Karl Marx article,
Yeah.
right? Very last end of it, right, there's 10 bullet points, right? Do you think any of those would be a good thing to adopt as a country? There would be at least one, right? I mean, number 10,
Oh, here we go.
free education for all children in public schools. We kind of agree with that, don't we?
Well, the U.S. actually practices this abolition of children's factory labor in its present form, and at the time of when he says present form, the conditions were pretty poor.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Well, when he wrote this, I believe he was in London.
Yeah.
Right?
Ooh.
Yeah, the chimney sweeps there.
Yeah, yeah.
The chimney sweeps
Well,
affected-
well, Jesus wasn't there. Well, I
Sorry.
mean, in a manner of speaking, of course. Sorry.
Do you think any, so the question is, do you think any of the bullet points would be, I'm sorry,
A good thing to adopt.
A good thing to adopt. I suppose
good.
what I'm slyly thinking here
a good
is most people, I think, in the United States, and with good reason, feel like anything communist is evil. But guess what? Actually, there's quite a lot associated with communism that we actually have already adopted.
Well, not too long after these points were made out, too.
I mean, that's part of the Communist Manifesto. All of those were radical. None of those were acceptable at the time. So those were all radical. However, yeah, if you watch Stephanie's
Get the DNA test that reveals insight into your ancestry, health, wellness, and more.
His argument against capitalism was that it was inherently unfair. His ideas on inequality have more resonance than ever today.
What Marx did do is to install this sense of urgency. Things cannot go on forever the way they are.
In this series, I'll tell you about the lives and revolutionary thinking of three extraordinary men: John Maynard Keynes, Friedrich Hayek, and Karl Marx. Their worlds were changing as never before. They saw that the fate of nations would hang on the power of money, and they had radically different ideas about how to control it. Today, the stakes could hardly be higher. All three of these men were giants whose ideas live on. But they speak to us right now because they, more than anyone, recognise the double-edged power of money. How markets could transform all of our lives, but also plunge us into chaos. Keynes and Hayek argued about whether government should try to tame this force of human nature, capitalism. Karl Marx had the most radical advice of all: get rid of it.
Since the Black Death. So the impact of the Industrial Revolution on life chances was absolutely terrifying.
This is a coal mine that I guess you can still go visit in England?
By 1849, his revolutionary writings had got Marx banned from everywhere but Britain. Here he could observe the power money had to ruin lives, at a suitably safe distance, of course.
I think in the last few minutes I've come closer to what it was actually like, the drudgery of Victorian times, than Karl Marx ever did. He never went to a mine, and as far as we can tell, he only went to a factory once, towards the end of his life. It didn't stop him writing vividly about the horrors of Britain's dark satanic mills.
The horrors of Victorian working conditions clearly shaped Marx's economics. In his time, minimum pay for proles meant maximum profits for bosses, and any bosses who did choose to pay more usually went bust.
He thought there'd always be downward pressure on wages, and that wages would come down to the minimum that enabled bare survival. They couldn't go lower than that, otherwise the workers would die. But he thought they'd be depressed down to that minimum. The reality, of course, has been the opposite. It has been a continual advancement in wages, year in, year out, decade in, decade out.
Marx was wrong. He thought it would all get so bad the workers would overthrow the system. Yet even as he was writing, reformers were beginning to get rid of the worst employment practices. Capitalism got kinder, not nastier, but the idea that the competing interests of bosses and workers would cause crises, well, that does seem relevant today.
Excellent BBC production, by the way, and so are some of her other ones. The ones that she does on Keynes and Hayek are also very interesting. And those are all still three individuals that are relevant today when we talk about economics in the big picture. Because Keynes argues that the state should be involved in the economics so that the state could come in and buy things or help run things in order to make sure that things run smoothly. Hayek basically comes in and says that anytime you do that, all you're going to do is make the system worse. Because the backlash when it comes because of anything you screw up that way is going to make things worse. And Marx doesn't really give us good advice for getting out of it. And by the way, Zizek argues the same way today, and he's fascinating to listen to. You saw him briefly, if you're not familiar with Zizek. But he's a Marxist today still, but he points out he doesn't think that communism should come back. Obviously not. It's really been demonstrated to basically everybody that it was a failure. Even those, except maybe the aged people who were on a pension and now have lost that, they're still convinced maybe that would be necessary. I can imagine if something happened to my pensions and I suddenly had to go work in a mine or something for a couple of weeks before I died, would probably be something I would find absolutely horrible too, because we are living in a socialist state in the sense that we can have a pension, a state pension that you guys are paying for. Thank you very much. All that sort of thing. Theoretically, I still work at least part-time because I show up here, right? You might think this is work, but actually this is absolutely fun. Boy, what would I do without this? I would have no goal for the whole week. Can you imagine?
To breed St. Bernard.
But the main reason I have the St. Bernard is so that I keep exercised enough so that I can keep doing this longer. It's not the other way around.
Well, I remember hearing something about sort of communist principles, and like what was described to me that there's a difference between little C communism and big C communism. What the Russians tried was big C communism that didn't work, but quote unquote little C communism is practiced in various little spots throughout the world, including the United States and certain communities, but it works, which is weird.
Well, it's just like the problem with what do we mean by sound, the forest, language is ambiguous. Did you have?
You can finish up the. I was just wondering if there was any other philosophers that had issues with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. It seems to be
John Stuart Mill is definitely has lots of issues with the way things were. He was a member of Parliament for a while, fighting against it, and actually did have influence and changed some of those laws that Stephanie just talked about were changing while John Stuart Mill was a contemporary of Karl Marx. In fact, he published On Liberty, which is the book that gives us really the beginnings of liberalism, right? In 1859, which is the same year that Charles Darwin publishes Origins of the Species. Right?
Yeah.
I didn't get my nap today. Sorry. It was one of those days. Now part of it is the St. Bernard problem. She's very, doesn't like being confined actually, but that's another thing. But John Stuart Mill would be one. And by the way, another that I always mention at that time period was Charles Dickens. Because Charles Dickens, if you look at the corpus of his novels, everyone's familiar with Christmas Carol, Mr. Scrooge, bah humbug, treating the family like crap, and learning from the ghosts that come to visit, that basically he's in trouble unless he reforms and becomes more generous, right?
I was watching some documentary, and it was on Ted Kaczynski, and he had like a big problem with the Industrial Revolution too. Is there any like current day philosophers that think that was like that you know of?
Noam Chomsky would be. You mean that the Industrial Revolution was bad in general?
Yeah,
We should not have done that?
Shouldn't have done that.
Well, there you're getting into like eco philosophy. Why is the world getting too hot for human beings to live in it? There are definitely folks in that area. I remember even local people did a presentation and said the best thing you can do for the environment is do less. Basically, anything you do is making the place warmer. And there's too many people. There's lots of arguments about the population crisis. When I was born in 1951, there was maybe 1 billion people, but now there are almost 8 billion people. So just in one lifetime, basically, we've quadrupled the number of people on the earth. And if everybody lived the way we do in Alaska, the earth would be overheated amazingly fast. You think of it, United States citizens use way more carbon than anyone else. Although China's carbon footprint is higher, but that part of that you have to remember is because we're importing all their stuff. So they're making stuff for us. But out of all of the states in the United States, Alaska has the highest carbon use per person because we live here. Just to keep our houses heated, to ship grapes from Chile so that we can have fresh fruit, relatively fresh fruit in our stores. I mean, we're using more energy just living here in Alaska. So if you want to save energy, move south someplace. But not Florida right now. That's probably not a good idea.
I was actually going to say, I remember the last time I went down to Florida to see grandparents, that, I just remember quietly noting that the house that they live in just doesn't have as much. The walls aren't so thick. There aren't vents everywhere. They don't spend thousands of dollars a year just to heat the house, or to keep the house safe. In fact, they're usually trying to shed heat more than anything else. But even that's a relatively cheap situation. Open the window, turn on the fan, kind of thing. And just kind of just remember thinking about it. Going, okay, I live almost as normal, right?
Well, one of the things that amazes me, though, about the guys that are into ecology and all that stuff is they tend to travel way more than anyone else I know to give speeches, like in Rio or in Asia, so they're like all over the place. Nice people, brilliant people, but they're in demand to give lectures all over the world, and so they use much more jet fuel getting all over the place to give these lectures to talk about how terrible global warming is.
Another example of that is I drive Uber, my car for Uber, and once in a while I get businessmen or politicians and stuff in the car, and they're going back and forth. One guy I met told me a story about Zuckerberg landing here in his private jet to refuel, because a lot of times they refuel when they're coming back over from international things, and he ordered about $5,000 worth of catering, and then had it all thrown away. So he didn't give it to anybody. He just decided he didn't want that, lobster and crab and all this stuff, and they had it all thrown away. And I said, well, don't you guys take a little bit of it? Oh yeah, well, but it was so much that we couldn't, eat it all. So there's a lot of people like that are fairly wealthy, and they advocate for clean environments or whatever, but they don't practice it. It's kind of hypocritical in that sense, and there's a lot of that goes on we never even see. Which brings me to something that I was thinking about in terms of the communist paradigm. If everybody gets an equal share, I mean, I want my sailboat, you know, and I want my Lexus, and I want, and so it becomes this endless stream of, well, if technology has the capacity for building a robot that'll wash all my dishes and fold my laundry for me, well, then everybody gets a robot, right? And everybody gets a drone, and everybody gets a private jet, and everybody. So it doesn't really work in the abstract like that. Whereas capitalism allows for, you know, if the human individual desires a certain particular end or a way of life for himself, and he has the capacity under a capitalist paradigm to pursue that. For instance, State of Alaska, I think it's Article 1, Section 4, specifically allows for the right of all Alaskans to pursue the rewards of their own industry. And that's at the heart of why capitalism works. And to his point, where you have small pockets of communism working, I think he might be referring to communalism, where people basically aggregate, and we see this in businesses even that are very successful, where they aggregate resources and then everybody has a share of the pot, rather than one CEO getting $1 million and then all of his lowerings getting $30,000 a year. You know, so and we see that model being actually really successful in businesses nowadays, where you're sharing the whole productivity pie with all the people that are involved in the productivity, instead of basically pushing it all towards the top of whoever invented the productive piece of asset.
Yeah, you're probably right there.
Did you have something to add to that? I thought. Well, of course, the problem with that everybody gets to compete model is that people aren't starting in the same place. Remember, Trump started with a small loan from his father, which now turns out to have been over $400 million. So he didn't start from the same place that everyone else did. Plus, not everybody has the same capability. Plus, not everybody has the same parents, not just Trump, but I mean, in terms of reading, I mean, you know, when we talk about being addicted to reading books, and my encouraging folks, I have folks in my classes that say, oh, what do you mean read a book? It would take me a whole year to read a book.
Someone
would
rather listen to it.
What about all your textbooks? And he says, well, I mean, why read when you can just get it off the internet or,
audiobooks.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the thing is, if his parents hadn't read to him when he was a child, which might, I'm assuming, since he can't imagine reading a book. Wow, you know, I remember one class I had where I had it was a class where I showed a long video of a discussion on collapse by Jared Diamond, and you know, I was encouraging folks to read Jared Diamond's book that he was just basically giving you an inkling of in the presentation. You know, and Collapse is maybe about 700, 800 pages, but it's tremendous. Well, the one student was absolutely thrilled with the idea, and so he says, I'm going to read that book. And so he went out and got a copy of it. And the next class, he saw me and he said, how do you read a book? Because he basically sat down, started reading, got up to like maybe page 2, and was mentally exhausted with the effort. And looked at the rest of the book and wondered, how the heck would anyone do this? How would you actually read through a whole book like this? Because if you've not practiced it and gotten started reading smaller books and then larger books, you know, the more difficult level, age levels, right? You know, The whole point of all of that, that you eventually get to college and you can read anything, basically. At least within your area of expertise, of course. But really, the more you could read of all sorts of things, the more you're going to understand what's going on. But you can't just imagine suddenly starting your reading ability by reading an 800-page tome on the nature of economics and world geography, world, weather and everything else, right? Absolutely fantastic book, by the way. Jared Diamond. And everyone was enthusiastic that I think of as interesting. I mean, they come to the Wendy Williamson, listen to Jared Diamond give the lecture, etc. He was here, right? I got to shake his hand and discover he was shorter than me, which was a surprise. But he had not had any experience reading up until now he's in college and he wants to get an education, and he doesn't have. It's like going to the Army and trying to pass your test doing 75 push-ups when you've never done a push-up before. You might be able to, to have someone explain to you, okay, this is a push-up, so you get down in this position, you go like this. Guess what? You'll probably do what? 3, 4, 5, maybe 15. You're not going to hit 75, until you've had at least a month or two of practice. And books take longer than that. So I would argue, and it's not just my argument, but there are others that will argue the same point, that in order to get ahead today, you have to have a higher education. To be part of the competing mass of people that are in that rat race trying to get a middle income out of things, you need to have a higher education. High school is not going to do it unless you get into a specific trade, etc. Right? I guess you've heard some of those arguments too.
But even those are usually some kind of
key of vocation.
Yeah. Well. But you have to have a mind that's functioning to even do that. And so there are 25% of the people in the state of Alaska have fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Guess what? That's a spectrum, but within that group, they're not going to compete. So they're not going to be able to take care of themselves. And so in a dog-eat-dog model, they get eaten. And boy, that's pretty horrible imagining. And to some extent, we can see that right here in Anchorage. When I drive certain parts of town.
So, I mean, the question to me is then, is it the state's responsibility to lift them up to a survivable level? Or is it charity's responsibility? And I think, that's what kind of we struggle with, is to what extent is the state responsible for taking care of those that are incompetent or incapable of helping themselves? And to what extent is that state program exploited, or what type of fraud or corruption is implicit in those types of state programs? Because there's an incredible amount of it. For instance, you can go to the back of the Safeway on 15th and Gamble and trade money for food stamps at whatever the ratio is going. It happens very commonly.
This book, I don't see where it's 2015. It's way earlier than that. It was from the 80s, I think.
Which would be my
argument. This has got to be a reprint, because the original was...
Losing Ground.
You remember that one?
Mm-hmm. It's sad, but I still think charity is best suited
on the
toward those ends,
inside
because
is-
when you implement a government program, you're paying, again, the taxpayer is footing the bill
84.
for sustenance, and they're also footing the bill for the administrative ends of that program. So it's tough, but I think charity is still better suited to it.
Well, this is the book that really transformed the way our Congress dealt with it. It was a government study, or at least it was a funded government study. It wasn't a government agency that did the study. It was Charles Murray that ran the study. And it basically was analysis of the Johnson era's war against poverty, the social, and before, did the policy changes from really even Roosevelt, FDR, did that really help? Right? And with regard to the charitable organizations, the churches especially, right? Those were an important part of every community. But when the state took over the main job, they ended up losing more and more of the participation in that, because people's taxes were taking the money away from the churches to help the local communities do that. And that what he points out, of course, in the advantage of it being local is that the people that are getting help know the people that are helping them and feel an obligation. And they don't feel they're owed the help. They realize that you're giving me of your own largesse in order to help me because I'm not able, and so I owe you. And another absolutely important part of this is churches typically require of the individuals that are getting a benefit through the church to participate in the church's narrative. In other words, you become that religion, right? I mean, you're encouraged to, right?
I guess they can use it as a channel for proselytization, but it's not a requirement.
Right,
For instance,
but
I can go into the Salvation Army and
works.
I don't have to be a Christian.
It definitely works, right?
Yeah, it's a
but
vector.
when the government comes in and you're owed a certain, welfare
So many
check
cans of
or
food,
right? You become convinced that the state owes you that money, right? And therefore, you're not necessarily encouraged, of course, to do anything in return for it, because that's what you're owed, right? So there's two different models of how to help people, but we shifted and we went to the state as that function, and that basically put the churches, for the most part, out of the business, and the churches don't have the infrastructure to do that anymore. So if we stop doing it as a government, there's no one left that will pick up that slack.
I think the same thing happens with healthcare too. There used to be places, if you didn't have health insurance, where doctors would treat you for free, out of because they could, because they were getting paid well and stuff. Not that I'm not. Immediately when I start saying that, people think I'm bashing Obamacare or something, and that's not the point I'm trying to make. It's just that the same thing has kind of happened in the healthcare industry as well. And now, if you get rid of
mental illness.
Yeah.
Of course, there's other things that affected mental illness.
Where are people going to go if you got rid of the?
Yeah, I know what you mean about it. If you're trying to remind people, hey, physics is involved in this. I mean, physics in the sense that you can have ideals and hopes, but if they don't actually work out, there's things that put a quash on dreams. And it's something that affects me more and more all the time. The older I get, for some reason, gravity seems to screw with me more. And, so I'm going to put this there. Flunk! It falls on the floor. It didn't, you know, it used to actually go on the spot where I put it. Now it doesn't, you know, or I put on glasses and I trip over things. Why did that happen, you know? So, very good point, and a wealth of stuff you know, that we can't cover all of it. But I do want to read this section here, I promised. And this is, because Marx, in being a Hegelian and picking up, you know, from his contemporaries, he does make, I mean, an attempt to outline the history of economics. His critique of Hegel, who gives us this evolution of culture for the first time, historicism. It's really not that long ago that our European academics began thinking of things in that evolutionary way, right? And Hegel applies it to culture. And remember, he does that in 1807. So by the time we get to Darwin, who's doing it with biology in 1859, John Stuart Mill, who's applying it to ethics in the same year, 1859, Wittgenstein applies it to language, but not until almost the 1940s, 1950s even. You know, so that idea that C.S. Lewis has that, you know, I'm teaching the meanings of the words, so you're an educated person. Today we think the meanings are dependent on the context, and it's a much more complex way of viewing language, which today we would say is more correct. You know, you're trying to impose restrictions on what language can do in the C.S. Lewis model, but later everything you know, is much more complex. So language evolves, mathematics evolves. That's Philip Kitcher and the nature of mathematical knowledge. Describes mathematics as evolving, and that's a hard one to accept, because you think of mathematics as being mathematics. You can't mess with mathematics, but actually our understanding of mathematics has certainly evolved, and to some extent, you know, we can interpret that as evolutionary. Geology, you know, the Earth is evolving, right? That happened. You know, that wasn't that long ago. People thought everything, and in fact, the reason different geological strata are named after various communities in England is because those were the English scientists that began walking around and saying, hey, how did this get like, this is different rock than over here. How did that happen? And they begin getting the idea of plates and shifting. They're still arguing over all of that, of course, right? So evolution as a narrative applied to all of these different things. Einstein relativity, right? So the universe is expanding as opposed to a static universe that Sir Isaac Newton thought.
I found this in a scientific publication recently that possibly the development of life itself and entropy is actually in itself a form of evolution. It's kind of a strange thing. There's a weird tie-in.
Did I mention Into the Cool, the book by Dorian?
Yeah,
saying,
yeah. But I found a publication recently that was more recent by someone who's just the past few years been working on a theory regarding basically trying to answer some of the issues science is having with trying to explain life as a natural phenomenon. And
Stuart Kaufman is fantastic. If you origins of what? Origins of life. What? 2014. Well, Stuart was up here. He's in Vermont now. Pretty strange. He was in Santa Fe when he came up here to speak. He argued that life you get life for free at a certain level of complexity. So life is not just some sort of miracle that all of a sudden, how do we explain it? But at a certain level of complexity, life happens. So it's got lots of articles, but I was looking for the book.
Well,
so
I think
Origins of Order was the one.
I think I know
At
where
Home in the Universe.
I think I know where this name is. I think because I think he was referenced by the guy I read, and I think somebody where his name.
I even got to talk to him while he was drunk. That was fun. That was fun. Yeah, because that was back when UAA had money, which is, I don't know if you've ever seen money, but it's a socially constructed, thing. But we used to have earmarks that Senator Stevens got for us, and that enabled us to have money to spend on things that we can't even think about anymore. But it used to be that they had enough money for the Complex Systems Group to invite speakers from all over. Remember, we had one guy from Madrid. I mean, you have people from all over. They're like the big names and doing stuff, and they would come up, and Thursday they would give a lecture to the whole community, whoever wanted to come, usually at the Wendy Williamson. And then Friday they would give a lecture that was harder, usually to faculty and other members of the community that thought they could figure out what they were talking about. But after the Friday session, we would take the speaker to a restaurant and have time just talking to them. And so that particular occasion, we took Stuart and his wife up to Girdwood, up to the Seven Glaciers. Seven Glaciers. I had never been in there before, never taken the thing up there. I was absolutely impressed. Plus, it was free because the money the university had for the event paid for my food too. But I got actually to sit next to him, and he was the one that defined what life was at a meeting in the White House with Vice President Al Gore when they were trying to send a craft to Mars to investigate and look for life. And Al Gore asked the group, "What is life?" And they all just sat there kind of stunned, except for Stuart, who said, "Any complex system that uses energy, performs one work cycle, and reproduces itself." So that was like their working definition of life. And I said to him while we were sitting there, and he was kind of tipsy at least, I said, by your definition, even I'm not alive, because I have friends that would say I never did a work cycle in my life. I've not reproduced, so. And he looked at me, well, no definition's good for everything. So that was fun. But let me read this. This is just out. In fact, did I mention, he starts the book off, you may or may not get a kick out of this. This book would not have been written had Donald J. Trump not been elected president in November 2016. So that's kind of fun. Imagine that. However, I'm going to read the section from. So, Marx gives us this evolution of economics, right? It's as far as Hegel's talking about the evolution of thought and thinking that has kind of a trickle-down effect to society. Marx says, nope, it's the means of production that changes, that evolves, and that has a trickle-up effect on the academics. So they're just thinking, oh, we've created this new political environment. No, it's the change in the means of production that actually changes the whole system, etc. Right? So, and then he went on to really blunder and think that he could predict the way things would eventually go. Right? So he's once capitalism has the entire world, basically everyone running things that way, the capitalists will end up with everything, and everybody else will be absolutely poor, right? And that will be totally unacceptable, as Stephanie points out, for one thing, because the poor people won't have the money to buy what the capitalists are trying to sell them. You need to keep paying the workers enough that they can buy what they're making, right? So that you can get the profit, right? But eventually it gets to the point where you know, they're competing for profit so much that everybody else is sucking wind. And as a result, they're going to revolt. And how does Marx think that's going to play out? Well, we're going to get rid of property. That's the list of 10 things. You know, get rid of private property. And what he means by that is the kind of property that gives you capital, right?
Actually, the first thing on the list, yes.
Right. You know, he thinks that's the real problem. Well, I would argue if we call it Big C, the Soviet Union wasn't really a successful communist state. For one thing, it didn't follow the pattern that Marx suggested, because they weren't a capitalist industrialized state at the time. They were really much more of a rural, backward society that the czars were trying to build up, but miserably at the time. But so Lenin changed Marxism by basically saying you can skip a few steps and impose it with a couple of 5-year plans and things. Well, that didn't really work. Instead, you ended up with a feudal society ruled instead of an educated class who had a morality, at least, with instead a bunch of gangsters, basically, which is what everyone says about what happened to the Soviet Union. So in a sense, they weren't really a successful communism. Neither is China, really. China is actually almost the same as it always has been. It's just instead of an emperor, now you had Mao and now Qi. So you've got, you know, pretty much the same thing.
Actually, the thing that disturbs me most about China is it sort of reflects more the nightmare capitalism that Marx predicted than it really does. The workers' rights and
empty cities, totally empty cities.
Yeah,
amazing. Yeah,
you know, sweatshops.
You could go there and get married. You know, they could use them as kind of a backdrop for a wedding. That's just absolutely crazy.
Kids working in sweatshops making shoes. I mean,
shoes. I'm sure everything I'm
probably everything I'm wearing too, honestly. But still, it reflects more the nightmare capitalism that Marx thought capitalism was.
Are the hats at Trump rallies make America great again? Are they really made in China? Does anybody know? Or is that just fake news? Are they really?
Some years ago now, and actually part of the reason I remember this is that Robin Williams actually brought this up in one of his bits. But like there was I guess a movement in California briefly of attempting to sort of boycott all things imported from China. Except there was a problem in the fact that the Chinese were making the signs and the shirts for it too. They were making both sides. They basically have this when they're exporting. They have a really shameless capital.
All the pins at the state fair, even the Made in Alaska pins, made in China. We don't have anyone here in Alaska that makes those, so you can't order them here. You have to order them from companies in China if you want them. Okay, I'm going to read some Fukuyama. So this is page 92. So this is kind of an update to how, in a very snapshot way, identity has evolved. So this book is titled Identity, the Demand for Dignity and the Politics of Resentment. which, wow, you know, once you read this and you apply it to what's happening in the news, you know, I'm thinking of that woman who was shouting at the senator as he was getting into the elevator in the Capitol building. You remember? And she says, you know, whatever she said, right? And he basically just waved at her and he says, "Don't you wave at me? Look at me when, you know," and he said, "When you grow up." And she was furious, right? That's how my daughter says furious. Furious, right? You know, if you think about it, he just insulted the crap out of her.